All right, diving in today, getting right to the heart of things, as philosophers like to do. We're going to tackle logic itself.
Oh, wow.
The very nature of logic.
Deep dive.
And we're going to talk about this idea of logical pluralism. So, multiple logic.
Multiple logics. Yeah.
Is that even possible?
Right. And, as a philosopher, you're probably already thinking, okay, well, there are multiple theories about everything. You know, we've got all these different ethical theories. We've got these different metaphysical theories. Why not logic, too, right?
Yeah.
So logical pluralism just kind of takes that idea that we're used to in other areas of philosophy, and it just extends it to logic itself.
Yeah. So it's like saying instead of absolute truth in logic, we have kind of these different frameworks that can all be valid.
That's right.
And we're going to draw on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy today to explore this.
Excellent source.
So we'll go through the arguments for and against logical pluralism, and we'll look at how people have thought about this and what some of the challenges are.
Yeah, absolutely. And, just to lay out a little roadmap for where we're going, we'll start with this idea of case-based pluralism, which is maybe the most prominent way of thinking about logical pluralism these days.
Okay.
And then we'll move on to some of the objections that people have raised. So worries about, how general can logic really be, right? If there are multiple logics, then how can any of them be normative, right? How can they tell us how we ought to reason? And then there's this worry about, maybe when different logicians are using different logics, they're actually just changing the meaning of the words. So maybe it looks like they're disagreeing, but actually they're not. And then finally, there's this really tricky issue about what logic should we use to reason about logics, which is the area of metalogic.
Yeah.
So, lots to cover, but hopefully we can kind of give a good overview of the debate and the main arguments.
Yeah. It's not about settling the debate. It's about kind of getting familiar with it.
Right.
And exploring it and seeing kind of what the landscape looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully along the way, we'll see why this is actually a really important and interesting debate for anyone who's engaged with the foundations of reasoning.
Okay. So should we jump in?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's start with case-based logical pluralism. Like you said, a really influential perspective in recent discussions. So the basic idea here is that what counts as a valid argument depends on how we understand the notion of a case.
Okay.
Right.
Right. And I think we frame this often with the generalized Tarski thesis.
Right, the GTP.
The GTP.
Yeah.
And that states that an argument is valid if and only if, in every case in which the premises are true, the conclusion is also true.
Right.
But then the question becomes, what is a case?
Right. Exactly. That's where all the action is, right? Because that's not a settled notion. We can think about cases in different ways. And depending on how we cash out that notion of a case, we're going to get different logics.
Okay.
Right. So, for example, in classical logic, we often think of a case as being like a first order model. Right. And that gives us classical logical consequence.
Okay.
But we could think about cases in other ways, right? We could think about them as possible situations. We could even allow for cases that are kind of incomplete or inconsistent, where some sentences are neither true nor false, or where some sentences are both true and false.
Right.
And that leads to other logics, right? Like intuitionistic logic or paraconsistent logic.
Okay. So somebody working in, intuitionistic logic is going to think about what is a counterexample to an argument very differently than a classical logician.
Yeah. Because they have a different notion of what can count as a counterexample. Right?
Yeah.
Because they're thinking about the cases in which arguments are evaluated differently. So one of the initial arguments that people have given for this pluralist view is what's called the argument from appearances. So I guess the idea here is something like this. Once you appreciate, the GTT, right, and you see that there are these different ways of understanding what a case is, and they all seem kind of, legitimate in their own right, well, then it just looks like pluralism is pretty plausible.
Right, because we've got these different ways of thinking about these scenarios in which an argument is evaluated.
Yeah.
And why should we say that only one of them is the right way?
Exactly. I mean, it kind of looks like all of them are, in some sense, getting at something correct about logical consequence. Mm-hmm. So that's the argument from appearances. But of course, philosophers being philosophers, there are counter arguments to the argument from appearances.
Right.
And so one worry, I guess, is that, just because a term like case is kind of, underspecified in our ordinary language,
right,
that doesn't mean that every way of precisifying it is equally good. Right. So think about a term like water, right? in our everyday talk, we might use the term water in a pretty flexible way. But of course, we now know, thanks to science, that water has a particular molecular structure.
Right, H2O.
Right, it's H2O. And so the thought is that maybe something similar is going on with case, right? Maybe even though it seems like we can understand case in all these different ways, there's still, one ultimately correct way to understand it, maybe one that somehow, carves nature at the joints, so to speak, one that really gets at the, the fundamental nature of truth and consequence, even if we need, some sophisticated philosophy or logic to figure out what that correct way is.
So maybe case has some kind of essential nature that we haven't quite grasped yet.
Yeah.
And maybe that will lead us to a monist view.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and the monist can also appeal to this idea of, kind of like vague terms, like a heap. Right. So just because it's kind of vague, how many grains of sand it takes to make a heap, that doesn't mean that, any way of drawing the boundary is equally good. It might just mean that the concept, just doesn't have a sharp boundary.
Yeah, right.
And so maybe something similar is going on with case, right? Maybe it's just that the concept of case is vague or context sensitive.
Yeah.
And that doesn't really support pluralism.
Right. It's just a kind of feature of language that it has these vague terms.
Yeah. And maybe that's all that's going on with the GT2. Okay. So that's, one sort of pushback against the argument from appearances. But the pluralists also have another argument that they like to appeal to, which is called the argument from virtue.
Okay.
So I guess the thought here is that there are actually some, nice features of pluralism, some virtues, if you like.
Right. Yeah. And I'm always interested in the benefits, right? Mm-hmm. Like, as a philosopher, I want to know what are the benefits of holding one view versus another.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So what are the benefits of pluralism? Well, one thing that pluralists often point to is that pluralism allows for a more charitable interpretation of debates in the history of logic.
Okay.
Right. So, when we look back at the history of logic, we see all these different logicians, defending different systems.
Right.
And often, they seem to be contradicting each other. Right. And so the monist has to say, well, look, one of these logicians is just wrong.
Right.
Right. But the pluralist can say, well, no, maybe they're both right. Right. Maybe they're just working with different notions of validity, different understandings of case.
Right.
And so that's a more charitable interpretation.
Yeah. So when we see a philosopher arguing for something, using, some principle that maybe a classical logician would reject, we could say, well, they're not necessarily wrong. Maybe they're working within a different logical framework.
Exactly.
Right.
And so pluralism is, it allows us to see more, rationality in the history of logic. Right. And it also, might encourage, greater innovation in logic, right? Because if you don't think that there's one true logic,
right,
then you might be more willing to explore different logical systems, right? And to see, what their properties are and how they might be useful in different domains. And, as a philosopher who works on, say, paradoxes or vagueness, you might also find certain non-classical logics to be really helpful, right, for analyzing those kinds of phenomena.
Right.
So there are these sort of practical benefits to pluralism as well as theoretical benefits.
But I'm sure people push back on this too, right?
Yeah.
Charity, well, that's great, but it can be misplaced.
Exactly. So there's this worry that, maybe the pluralist is being too charitable, right?
Right.
Maybe they're kind of like, reading in, too much sophistication into these historical figures, or right. Or, maybe they're attributing beliefs to people who just didn't have the concepts to have those beliefs.
Yeah, like the classic Wesson selection task example. People often make choices that don't seem classically logical, but probably they're just misunderstanding the task. It's not that they're working with a different logic.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah. And so, the thought is that maybe the pluralist is just being too charitable to these historical figures, and maybe they're actually being uncharitable to the monists.
Okay.
Right, maybe they're kind of like, just dismissing the monist view as being, too narrow-minded or something.
So both sides accuse each other of being uncharitable.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's not as simple as saying that pluralism is more charitable, right? It really depends on how you're thinking about these issues.
Okay, yeah, it's a complicated one.
Okay, so those are, some initial arguments for and against case-based pluralism. But now let's move on to some of the objections that have been raised to this view. And maybe we should start with the generality objection.
Okay, yeah, the generality objection. And I mean, as a philosopher, I do like the idea of logic being very general.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, the thought here is that, ideally, a logical principle should hold in all possible cases, right? It shouldn't be restricted to just certain kinds of cases. So if there's even one case, where an argument with a certain form has true premises and a false conclusion, well, then the argument isn't really logically valid.
Right.
Right. In the strictest sense.
So why would we want to limit the kinds of cases that we're considering? Shouldn't logical validity be something that's totally, general across all possible cases?
Exactly. That's the worry. But of course, the pluralist might push back and say, well, look, if you insist on this really strong notion of validity,
right,
you might end up with a logic that's so weak that it can't really do much work.
Right. So we could end up with logical nihilism where there's no valid arguments.
Right, exactly. So there's this worry that, if you push the generality objection too far, you're going to end up with a logic that's so weak that it's not really interesting or useful, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a tricky issue. But, there's also this other thought, which is that maybe some inferences are valid, not because they hold in all possible cases, but because of the meanings of the logical connectives involved.
Right.
Yeah. So, for example, Priest has this argument that conjunction elimination, right? So the inference from A and B to A,
right,
that's valid, not because it's true in all possible cases, but just because of what and means. Right?
Yeah.
So no matter how you think about cases, if A and B is true, then A has got to be true.
Right.
So there's this thought that maybe some inferences, their validity just flows from the meanings of the connectives themselves.
Yeah. But again, that's a whole other debate, right?
Yeah.
What is the meaning of and how do we figure that out?
Exactly, yeah. That's a whole other can of worms. Mm-hmm. But it's something that, philosophers have been debating for a long time.
Right.
And it's not clear that there's a simple answer to that question. Okay, so there's, this worry about generality, but then there's also a more specific worry about what kind of cases we should be considering.
Okay.
Right. So there's this response that pluralists sometimes give, which is called the response from polysemy.
Okay.
And the thought here is that, maybe the problem isn't that pluralists are considering the wrong number of cases.
Right.
Maybe they're considering the right number of cases, but they're thinking about the kinds of cases in the wrong way.
Okay.
Right. So the thought is that maybe the term case is polysemous, meaning that it has multiple meanings.
Okay. Yeah, like the word bank.
Exactly. Yeah, like bank. So, bank can refer to a financial institution,
right,
or it can refer to the side of a river. And so the thought is that maybe something similar is going on with case, right? Maybe in some contexts, when we're talking about cases, we're thinking about, model theoretic structures.
Right.
And in other contexts, we're thinking about, possible worlds or situations.
I do.
And so if that's right, then maybe the monist is just making a kind of category mistake.
Okay.
Right? When they say, oh, but you're not considering all the cases.
Right. Like if I say that all banks need to have tellers and you point to the side of a river, you're not really understanding what I mean.
Exactly. Yeah. You're talking about a different kind of bank.
Yeah.
And so maybe the pluralist is saying something similar, right?
Right.
They're saying, look, when I'm talking about cases, I'm thinking about this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about cases, you're thinking about this other kind of thing.
Right.
And so, we're just talking past each other.
Right. So it's not just about the number of cases. It's about what we're even considering.
Exactly.
To be a case.
Yeah. So that's the response from polysemy. But of course, the monists can push back on this too, right?
Right, of course.
They can say, okay, fine, maybe case is polysemous,
right,
but there's still probably one best meaning of case.
Yeah.
Right? One that really captures what we're interested in when we're talking about logical consequence. And, maybe they'll say that this best meaning of case is somehow sensitive to the meanings of the non-logical terms in the arguments.
Right.
So, for example, the inference from is read to as is colored.
Right.
That seems to be valid.
Right.
But it doesn't seem to be valid just in virtue of its logical form.
Yeah.
It seems to be valid because of the meanings of red and colored.
Right.
And so the monist might say, look, the best notion of case is one that somehow takes into account these kinds of, semantic relationships between the non-logical terms. Yeah, so that's another way that the monist can push back against the pluralist. Okay, so, we've been talking about the generality objection.
Yeah.
But there's another objection that's often raised against logical pluralism, which is the normativity objection.
Okay, and the normativity of logic, this is huge for philosophy.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the thought here is that logic isn't just descriptive, right? It's not just telling us how we do reason. It's also telling us how we ought to reason. Right?
Yeah.
So it's got this normative force.
Yeah.
And so if you're a logical pluralist and you think that there are multiple correct logics, then it's not clear how any of those logics can be normative.
Yeah.
Right? Because if one logic tells you that you ought to infer a certain conclusion and another logic tells you that you ought not to infer that conclusion, well, then what are you supposed to do?
Yeah, it feels like if logic's a guide for our reasoning, it's not a very good guide if it's giving us contradictory advice.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the thought is that, if logic is supposed to be normative, then there's got to be one correct logic.
Right.
Right? One that tells us how we ought to reason.
Right.
And so that's the normativity objection.
Okay. And then I know there's also the change of meaning objection, which really gets into whether these disagreements are even real.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting one.
Yeah.
So the thought here is that, when different logicians are using different logics,
Right.
maybe it looks like they're disagreeing about something,
Yeah.
but actually they're not really disagreeing
Right.
because the logical vocabulary just means different things in those different logics.
Right. So maybe when they're saying and or not,
Right, exactly.
they're actually talking about different things.
Yeah.
And so it just looks like there's a disagreement, but there's really not.
Yeah. And, Quine famously made this point about negation. Right. He said that if someone tries to, give you a different account of negation, well, they're not really talking about negation anymore.
Yeah.
They're just talking about something else.
Right.
And so maybe something similar is going on with all the logical vocabulary.
Okay.
Right. So this is sometimes called the change of meaning objection.
Right.
Right. And, Jortland has this nice distinction between what he calls A variance and B variance.
Right.
So A variance is where the meaning of valid itself differs across different logics.
Okay.
And B variance is where the meanings of the connectives differ.
Okay.
Right.
So the word valid could mean different things?
Exactly. Yeah. And so if that's right, then, when one logician says that an argument is valid and another logician says it's not, well, maybe they're just using the word valid in different senses.
Right.
And so there's no real disagreement.
Yeah.
And the same thing could be going on with the connectives, right? So maybe, and means one thing in classical logic, and it means something slightly different in intuitionistic logic.
Okay.
And so, again, there's no real disagreement.
Yeah. It's like saying a bank is on the corner and a bank is next to a river. Well, they're different things.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the worry.
So in order to really make the case for pluralism, we need to show that these disagreements are, about the same thing.
Right, exactly. Yeah, we need to show that there's some shared core concept of validity.
Right.
That everyone's talking about, and that they're really disagreeing about that concept.
Right.
Right. So that's a challenge for the pluralist. So how do they respond to this? Well, one thing they can do is just bite the bullet and say, okay, fine, maybe there are different kinds of validity.
Okay.
Right? And so maybe classical logic is correct about one kind of validity, and intuitionistic logic is correct about another kind of validity.
Right.
And so it's not that they're disagreeing, it's just that they're talking about different things. Right. Another thing they can do is appeal to this idea of context sensitivity.
Okay.
Right. So they can say that, the word valid is context sensitive, meaning that its meaning depends on the context in which it's used.
Okay.
Right. And so in the context of classical logic, valid means one thing.
Right.
And in the context of intuitionistic logic, it means something slightly different.
Okay.
Right. And so again, there's no real disagreement. And then finally, they can try to give a unified account of the meanings of the connectives.
Right.
Right. So maybe they'll appeal to some, proof theoretic rules or
Yeah.
some model theoretic interpretation
Yeah.
that's shared across all the different logics.
Okay.
Right. And so they can say, look, even though these logics look different on the surface,
Right.
they're all actually using the connectives in the same way. So those are some ways that the pluralist can respond to the change of meaning objection. Okay, so we've talked about generality, we've talked about normativity, we've talked about change of meaning. Now we got to talk about the really tricky one, which is metalogic.
Right. The logic we use to reason about logic itself.
Yeah. This is where things get really meta and really fun.
Yeah.
Right? So the metalogic objection, I guess, is this. if you're a pluralist and you think that there are multiple correct logics, then what logic are you supposed to use when you're reasoning about those logics?
Right.
Right? Like when you're trying to give an argument for pluralism.
Right. Right.
Right. You got to use some logic to do that,
Yeah.
but which one do you use? And so, as Finn has pointed out, it looks like you need at least some basic logical principles to get your meta theory off the ground, right? You need something like, universal elimination. You need modus ponens. And, Griffiths and Passot have argued that it's actually really hard for the pluralist to come up with a meta logic that's both, strong enough to do the work they need it to do.
Right.
But also, compatible with all the different logics that they want to endorse.
Right, because if they pick a logic that's too weak, then they can't really say very much in their meta theory.
Yeah, it's going to be really hard to, give a good account of what pluralism is and why it's true.
Right.
If you're using a really weak logic. But if you use a logic that's too strong, then you're going to rule out some of the logics that you want to endorse.
Right.
Right, and so it's really hard to find that sweet spot.
So what if they just say, well, I'm a pluralist when I'm thinking about these different logics, but then when I'm doing my meta theory, I'm just going to be a monist.
Right. Yeah, so that's a natural thought, but it's not clear that that's a stable position.
Okay.
Right, because you might worry that you could sort of sneak in principles from your stronger metalogic into your weaker object logic.
Right.
Right. So, for example, let's say that you're using classical logic as your metalogic.
Right. But you're endorsing, some weaker logic, like K3, as your object logic.
Okay.
Right. Well, then you could sort of ascend to the meta language, use classical logic to prove something about the truth values of sentences in your object language, and then disquote back down to the object language.
Yeah.
And you could end up with a conclusion that you couldn't have derived in K3 itself.
Okay.
Right?
Right.
So it's like you're kind of cheating. Right. You're using your stronger metalogic to get around the limitations of your weaker object logic.
Right.
And so the worry is that, if you're going to do that, then why not just use the stronger logic in the first place?
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's a worry about this kind of two-tiered approach. And Griffiths and Passot have argued that, what you really need is a kind of harmony between your metalogic and your object logic.
Oh, okay.
Right. They should kind of fit together nicely.
Right.
But it's not clear how the pluralist can do that.
So what's the pluralist to do? Right. Yeah. So this is a tough one. But one thing they can try to do is to relativize the meta logic. Okay. Right. So they can say, look, the logic that we use in our meta theory should be sensitive to the properties of the object language that we're studying.
Okay.
Right? So, for example, if the object language has empty names, well, then we might need to use a free logic in our meta theory.
Right.
Right? Or if the object language has, semantic paradoxes, then we might need to use a paraconsistent logic.
Okay.
But if the object language doesn't have those features, then maybe we can use a stronger logic, even classical logic.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
So the idea is that the metalogic isn't fixed, it's relative to the object language.
Right. And that's kind of like what we see in some forms of monism too, right?
Yeah,
They
yeah.
restrict their strong logic to certain domains.
Right, exactly, yeah. So the pluralist might say, look, I'm not saying that classical logic is never valid. I'm just saying that it's only valid in certain contexts.
Right.
Right. And those contexts are the ones where, the things that lead to the paradoxes and the counterexamples don't arise.
Okay.
Right. So that's one way that the pluralist can try to respond to this worry about metalogic.
Okay. So now I want to talk about this idea of logical nihilism.
Oh, yeah, this is a fun one.
Which is this pretty radical idea that maybe there's no correct logic.
Right. Yeah, it's a really radical view, but it's also kind of intriguing, right?
Right.
Because it really forces us to think about, what is logic all about? So logical nihilism is the view that there are no logically valid inferences, right? There are no logical truths.
Right.
Right.
And so as a philosopher, that's kind of terrifying.
Yeah, it's a scary thought, right? Because it means that, there's no ultimate foundation for our reasoning.
Right.
Right.
So are nihilists saying that they don't think modus ponens is ever valid?
No, they're not saying that.
Okay.
Right. What they're saying is that there's no general principle of modus ponens that's always valid.
Right.
Right. So they might be perfectly happy to accept that, in this particular case, if P then Q, P therefore Q, that's a valid inference.
Right. Okay.
But they'll deny that there's any kind of general rule that says modus ponens is always valid.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
And so the argument for nihilism is really interesting because it kind of piggybacks on the generality objection.
Right.
Right.
Right. We were talking about how that could lead to nihilism.
Exactly. Yeah. So the nihilist just accepts the conclusion of the generality objection.
Okay.
Right. So they say, okay, yeah, you're right. If an inference is valid, then it has to be truth-preserving in all cases.
Right.
But for every inference, there's some case where it's not truth-preserving.
Right.